Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. I would like to just, here's what I'm going to speak about. First, NESTA and our approach to regulatory innovation, and challenge prizes as part of regulatory innovation. And after, I'm going to try to keep my remarks to 15 minutes so there's time for us to have a back and forth, because you'll see that although my examples are not about veterinary medicine, we think there's a big potential for using regulation as a way to stimulate innovation. So basically, please raise your hands if people have heard of NESTA before. Okay, so quite a number of you. So we're an independent global innovation foundation, and what we do is we work on everything around innovation. So it means bringing new technologies to projects for public benefit. And that might mean helping local councils, it might mean helping farmers in Nepal, in terms of how to deal with crops and get information and be able to use it in real time. And also, as was mentioned, I personally work on health projects and run the biggest prize that we have at the moment, which is the Longitude Prize. And you can see the organizations that we work with. So governments, foundations, as well as companies sometimes. And so you might be I'm guessing that you haven't really heard about anticipatory regulation necessarily. Under common narrative, this is what the general thinking was. Let's say the tradition. Intervene too early and potentially valuable innovation can be throttled. So in other words, you have to let things grow and regulation can be dangerous, I think is the message. And second, intervene too late and new forms of harm may become embedded, right? So this is the tradition. And we're kind of breaking that at NESTA and talking about regulation that can create an enabling environment. And actually, we go a step further than that, because we say that regulation can actually have specific goals about what you want to accomplish, and you can actually change the reality by creating test beds. So there are three different types of ways that we can think about regulation. First, advisory, so helping new products and services adhere to existing regulations, right? That's about compliance, most basic regulatory function. Adaptive is support new innovation by adapting existing regulatory framework. So that's looking at what's happening and adapting to it. And the third, anticipatory, is much more of a back and forth, a kind of feedback loop. So basically, the regulations get influenced by engaging with innovators. So NESTA's produced a framework and basically, we've mapped what's going on and worked with regulators. And we're basically have some very concrete methodology to help different regulators work through problems, see what priorities are, and actually make an action plan for how to be proactive. And our thinking, and actually NESTA came up with this concept, has been taken up by BEIS, which is the Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. And actually, they created a fund, and a lot of the work that I'm about to talk about, they are actually funding. And so here are more of the specific elements of anticipatory regulation. I'd like to just point to decentralized experimentation, because a lot of what we focus on is creating safe environments for test beds so that there's not necessarily one answer, but there's people working within a framework around the country doing projects. And I think that decentralized aspect of this is kind of unique, because if you think about it, usually regulation is the opposite. It's very a centralized approach. And proactive, as I mentioned, it's about changing the reality of what the regulation is. And I won't go into these, but I just wanted to bring them up because if you're interested in looking at the process, the first document was published in 2017. So I didn't mention at Nesta, we have quite a number of people who work on policy issues and write white papers that often end up getting taken up by governments, both here and around the world. And the second publication actually came out this year, and it's based, we do the policy work, research and then policy, and then we bring it out into the world and work with practitioners. And so the second document, Renewing Regulation, actually goes through some of the case studies and practical examples. So I actually am at the Challenge Prize Center within Nesta. We're about 40 professionals at the moment. And I'm not going to actually go into prizes that are not in this space of participatory regulation. But I'll just tell you that at the moment we have 13 active prizes. And what they are is they're competitions which are run either domestically or internationally. And usually, in its most raw form, there's a problem that we're trying to solve. If you think of your ecosystem, the problem would be defined by a group of experts, a lot of who are in this room today. And through a public competition, the idea is to bring in people that ordinarily wouldn't be involved in solving the challenge. So what that means is there might be people from engineering communities that you don't necessarily interact with, or from some of the companies or academic institutions that are working on some of these technologies. So in general, in terms of Nesta Challenges, which is, as I said, the group that I'm part of, we create better solutions. So in that case, the winner of the prize may have invented a new product. And we don't give awards for doing something clever. We give awards to actually, with the idea of things getting onto the market. Maybe it will be bought by a larger company, or maybe the company will be a startup that will grow itself. And we also do a lot of fostering communities of innovators and bringing people together around a very specific problem. And when we say unlock systemic change, it means we use communications a lot and we raise awareness about issues. Okay, so now to the last part of the presentation, because I am going to leave time to discuss. Here are 3 different anticipatory regulation challenge prizes. And the first one is called the Open Up Challenge, and it was about retail banking. Basically, the reason why the Competition and Markets Authority was there is they thought it was terribly anti-competitive that the big banks have our data, but if people want to sell products, they don't have access to that data. So it was about how do you make that data available to companies that are selling things to businesses. The second one, totally different, Flying High, which is about drones, and we'll speak a little bit more about that. And the third one we're just launching, actually, it's about using AI to give advice to people for legal matters. And that's a prize that is ongoing at the moment, because there is a lot of work that shows that oftentimes people don't have access to legal expertise, and it has really huge consequences. So challenge prizes can contribute to regulatory innovation through direction, so defining goals. And that's why we go through a long process of research and working with experts to define, well, what do you actually want to change, and what's the state of play in terms of the innovation. The second one, iteration, we've discussed. Confidence, if you can do a transparent process, and actually the public follows along, then they will be more on board and you'll have less problems. And as I said, adoption, it's actually changing the regulations as part of the process. So I have three bit more detail. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. I just want to give you an idea, especially in this first case, the Open Up Challenge. How does a challenge prize actually work, and what are the different phases? So here, the idea was a bespoke data sandbox. And what a sandbox means is you take a data set and you make it available to people so that they can use it, and normally they wouldn't have had access to it. And you do that, and so if you think of it in the veterinary context, in a safe environment. So you can actually monitor what's going on and help people to innovate with real information without taking risks. And if you jump down to the bottom, it just shows the way that we stage our prizes. So in the first hand, it was pretty open. People had to give written ideas, and then they were given funding, and then they went to another phase where they got additional funds. And then in the summer of 2018, we went up to 100,000 pound grants for 12 ventures. And these tended to be small and medium-sized enterprises, startups, and sometimes enterprises, there are academic groups. And then there were final prizes that were given. And to make it a lot more concrete, I think there's two here that I want to focus on. One is the Scotsman who said, it is an irony that research has shown that 1 in 5 small business owners strike out on their own to try to cut stress, but 1 in 3 say dealing with business finances is their biggest source of stress. And so this was about, what type of products do they need to make managing their business more, to make it easier and to have it be more integrated. So the second of the three is the SRA Access to Justice Law Tech Challenge. And this is the one that is ongoing. And the idea, as I mentioned, I've basically highlighted what I think are the most important point here. Draw AI innovators in from outside legal services into the sector, inform their evolving regulatory approach to ethical AI-powered legal services. So you can imagine the issue of liability, as it is very important with vets, is very important in this case. Imagine if you create a system and it's bad advice that leads people to have negative consequences from a legal perspective. They have a lot to lose. So that's why you need to do this process within a safe space. And flying high, we all know that drones are used as killing machines, right? And they are used to spy. But what if drones were used for good? And so this project actually, with 5 UK cities, there was work done to say, okay, well, what are the most important things? What could you use drones for? So for example, I know the next presentation is NHS. It's actually NHS Improvement that we worked with here for ideas about using drones for delivery. And the state of this project is that the first phase is done. So the 5 cities were used to talk about what were the most, another idea that they focused on. One city looked at disaster response. Another one looked at supporting emergency response. So this one is going to go into a second. Okay, so as I promised that we did want to have some discussion. So I'd like to open it up and say, what things do you think? Some people in the crowd have mentioned to me that they have run up against some barriers in terms of regulation. So are there things that you want to mention that you think that this type of process could be beneficial for? And maybe you'd like to see a sandbox Does anybody have any ideas or things that they've encountered? Okay, so let me ask you, one of the things that in the preparation for this meeting came up was undercare. Apparently, tell me if I'm correct, that undercare is defined as you have to have proximity of the animal. Is there anybody here who thinks that that regulation should be explored or should change? Go ahead.
I think everybody's sitting on their hands somewhat deliberately because for me that's an elephant in the room. And well done for RCVS for saying that out loud. Sorry, you can hear me now. Well done for putting that up there because I think everyone's sitting on their hands. It's the elephant in the room. So for me, the big topic at the moment is telemedicine.
Right.
Not B2B, B2C. So the end consumer and the definition and the code of conduct for which we're regulated. So that for me is ripe for a sandbox approach, test and learn.
Does anyone else have any comments on that? Please. Oops.
Thank you, yeah. David Catlow, work in the charity sector. To me, the big discussion, perhaps one more for the sandbox rather than telemedicine, and it's actually interesting to see what the solicitors are doing, talking about widening access to justice. I wonder if the sandbox is widening access to veterinary services. We hear a lot about the sort of more advanced technologies that are for those who can afford them, but actually widening access to veterinary services in the UK. Telemedicine may play a part in that, but I think there's a bigger question out there.
So just so you know, what's happened traditionally is government, for example, if that is brought to the attention of government and members of parliament, then there can be funds allocated to look at a specific issue. And that's usually how we get projects at Nesta. Please.
So just following on from that, Ian Richards, independent veterinary consultant. David's there mentioned the potential issue of lack of access to veterinary services. How do you, guiding these regulations, look to see that there is a lack of access, or are you just going to take somebody's word for it because they actually want to sell something? He says bluntly.
Yeah. So the answer is, I don't have one answer, but the answer is that a lot of times we depend on academic work, and then also Nesta does research ourselves. So it could be either way. Perhaps government commissioned research, perhaps an academic group did research. But you're underlining a point. If you really want to move something forward, then if you have proof of a study that would be widely accepted about a problem of access, then you have something. Go ahead.
Hi there, Trevor Hardcastle. I'm the Chief Data Scientist of Vet AI, the company behind the Joy app. So I think the key word in that bullet point there is evidence. I think it's critically important that we provide evidence, and my company's actually carried out a clinical trial for remote diagnosis of dermatology conditions, and subject to a sort of a traditional statistical analysis, we found that remote diagnosis in that particular domain is in fact very accurate. The sample size was relatively small, but I think what we really want to do is have this conversation and begin to explore the various domains of veterinary medicine where the regulations could perhaps be relaxed in the face of evidence. But it's really important to map that out because as the RCVS's own telemedicine review from 2018 showed, I think it was a survey of about 5,000 professionals, if I'm not mistaken. It depends because the risk, for example, in neurological or pain issues is just too high. Whereas with things like lumps and skin conditions, it's very different.
So it brings up a good point because one of the aspects of challenge prizes is the validation has to be very, very rigorous. So we don't wait until after the fact and decide what will the validation methodology be. But actually, what we call the prize rules, so the written document that defines what you have to do to win a prize, and how you have to prove that you've met certain criteria, would have specific information about what would the validation entail. And then in order to win, the different participants would need to provide that data. I'm making it sound a lot more black and white than it is, because as you can imagine, there's sometimes some gray area, and then the judging panel has to make the final decision. But the concept is we keep it safe in this situation because there are controls. It's not as rigorous, obviously, as a controlled trial, but there are controls built in to avoid harm. But so it's a way to, at the end, the information can be used by the regulator to decide if the rules should potentially change.
So in that context of the sandbox, currently remote prescribing would be outside of what a vet would do under the Code of Conduct, and therefore, if there were going to be experimentation, how do you work experimenting with regulations to, I don't know whether the right word is indemnify those from the potential harm, as long as it's well controlled, well looked after?
For example, we're working with the Canadian government because they had some legislation that created a unit within the Canadian government that specifically is designed to help the different departments of government when they want to deal with these type of issues. So there's an innovation coming, but the way the rules are written would make it impossible to experiment. So in that case, what you would do is you would create a safety mechanism, and there would be exceptions during the period of the sandbox, so that there could be experimentation. And of course, the regulator gets covered because there are experts that would weigh in on how to do that. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.